that followed them everywhere. Drew me to the scene. What this means, what Joe is saying here, is it made me interested in something. Really drew me to the scene, made me interested. And Joe goes on to say, it was like, almost like a bazaar, sort of. Bazaar is, in this case, is a traveling marketplace where goods and services were exchanged or sold. And then I say, and Joe says, you know, and I say again, and then Joe says, and then I say, well, it's definitely a subculture of America. Subculture is a small part of a large group. And Joe says, oh, yeah. I mean, some people even called it a cult. And then he laughs and says, you know, a cult, this is a group of people who has strong beliefs about something. And then I laugh. And Joe says, and it was so unique at the time. Unique meaning different. He goes on to say, you know, because there really wasn't anything else like it. I mean, you had all these hippies driving around. Now, a hippie or hippies is a person or people with long hair. Well, actually, it's not all people with long hair. Usually, hippies don't believe in war. They want peace. John Lennon of the Beatles was a hippie. And Joe goes on to say, I mean, you had all these hippies driving around, following the band from city to city. And, you know, when you're on the road driving from one place to the next, you'd see the same people, you'd see the same cars, all these VW buses driving. VW, this is short for Volkswagen. So a Volkswagen bus is a small German-made bus. And Joe goes on to say, and, you know, people supported themselves. Supported means made money. And he says, by selling things in the parking lots at the concerts. And I say, And then Joe says, like, a lot of people would, like, make jewelry and sell it. A lot of people would sell clothes that they made. Another favorite amongst people was to, amongst means with. And he goes on to say, just sell beer or to make food. And that's what I actually did a lot of the times. I'd make sandwiches. A sandwich is 2 pieces of bread with food in between. And this is something that is commonly eaten in Western countries. And then Joe goes on to say, or I'd sell beer in order to help, you know, defray the cost of the tickets. Defray means to pay for. Defray. An example of defray is, I got a job at the cafe to help defray the cost of my car. Defray. And then I say, And Joe says, because it could get a little expensive, you know? And then I say, right. And Joe says, but, you know, the other strange thing is that you'd have this, like, large circus. A circus is a group of performers or artists. So he says you'd have this large circus traveling essentially, or basically, following the band, and it was all these, like, hippies. People with, like, really long hair and beards, and a beard is hair that grows down the sides of a man's face and also across the chin of a man's face. So Joe goes on to say, and, like, you know, really sometimes, like, people who hadn't, like, showered or cleaned their body for days, cleaned their bodies. And Joe says, because they were just traveling with the, you know, and then I say, yeah. Joe says, around, following the band. And then I say, yeah. And Joe says, because, you know, especially during the summer, or even more during the summer, you just stay at campgrounds, you know? A campground is a place to sleep in a tent in the woods. And Joe goes on to say, so you'd camp and they might not have a shower, you know? And then I say, right, and I laugh. And Joe says, I remember like so many times washing my hair like under a faucet in a sink of a bathroom. A faucet is the metal part of a sink where the water comes out. And Joe goes on to say, under a hose somewhere, and he laughs. A hose is made from rubber, and it's usually used outside to water plants. And then I just laugh. And Joe says, and having someone help me because, I had the long hair. And I laugh again. And Joe says, oh, man. And, the other thing is, you'd travel around. Travel around means to go from one place to another place. Travel around. For example, when I go to a country for the first time, I do not like to stay in one place. I prefer to travel around. And Joe goes on to say, and sometimes be driving through these really small conservative towns. Conservative means people who do not like change. So these towns have people in them who do not like change. And Joe goes on to say, and you can just imagine, or you can just think, what it must have been like from their standpoint. So what he's saying is you can imagine, or you can think what it must have been like from their eyes, or from their view, from what they were seeing, their standpoint. And then Joe says, they see these people who don't look anything like them. And then I say, right. And Joe says, they're all clean-cut looking. Clean-cut means having short hair and being dressed nicely. Clean-cut. For example, Derek used to be clean-cut, but now he has long hair. Clean-cut. And Joe goes on to say, these people who live in this town, and then you have this pack of looks like bohemian gypsies. Pack is just a group of people. Bohemian gypsies. These are traveling artists. Bohemian gypsies. And then I say, and Joe says, traveling through town. And then I say, yeah, that's a good description. Or that's a good way to say it. And Joe says, a lot of the times the cops in the town would hassle you. Cops are police. An example of cops would be the cops caught the bank robber. Cops. And hassle means to bother. And Joe says, and I say, oh, I'm sure. And then Joe says, for no good reason, And then I say, yeah. And Joe says, I think that they would just suddenly jump to conclusions. So suddenly means quickly. Quickly jump to conclusions. About. Jump to conclusions. This means to decide something without knowing about it. Jump to conclusions. For example, Sarah always jumps to conclusions. She makes decisions before learning all the information about something. Jump to conclusions. And Joe goes on to say, about, what you were doing because you look different than them. They were completely judging the book by its cover. Judging the book by its cover. This means deciding what something is like by how it looks. Judging the book by its cover. For example, when I was 14 years old, I had a friend with purple hair. When my mom saw him, she did not like him. I told her that she was just judging the book by its cover because she did not even know him.